Most people already understand that choices have consequences. They know it intellectually. They've heard it their entire lives. And yet, they keep making the same choices they already know will cost them. So the real issue isn't that people don't understand cause and effect. The real issue is that understanding it doesn't automatically mean you use it. That's what this video is about. Not explaining consequences again, but explaining why knowing better so often fails to change behavior and what actually does. Because the problem isn't ignorance, it's something quieter than that. Number 1, consequences are feedback, not events. Most people think of consequences as events, something that happens later. A breakup, a burnout, a blow-up conversation, a financial mess. They experience consequences as moments that arrive suddenly and often feel personal. But consequences aren't events. They are information your life is giving you in real time about alignment, direction, and whether your choices are supporting you or quietly working against you. That tight feeling in your chest when you procrastinate isn't random. It's feedback. The low-grade anxiety you feel when you avoid something you know you should handle isn't stress. It's feedback. And the calm that shows up after you make a clean decision or set a clear boundary is feedback too. When you treat consequences like isolated events, they feel unpredictable and hostile. When you learn to see them as feedback, life starts making sense. A lot of people miss this because they're waiting for consequences to announce themselves loudly. They are waiting for something dramatic enough to justify change. A crisis, a blow-up, a moment they can point to and say, see, that's where it all went wrong. But most consequences don't arrive like that. They arrive quietly. They show up as tension you can't quite explain, as irritation that feels out of proportion, as a low-grade dread you carry through the day, or as the sense that you're always recovering from something instead of building anything new. Those aren't personality flaws, they are signals. Your system is incredibly good at tracking alignment. Long before something goes wrong, your body knows when a choice is off. It knows when you are avoiding something that matters. It knows when you are tolerating something that's draining you. And it tries to tell you, softly at first. The problem is most people are trained to override that feedback. They normalize it. They tell themselves it's just stress or adulthood or how life is. And by the time the consequences finally get loud enough to demand attention, the cost is much higher than it ever needed to be. Learning to read feedback early doesn't make you dramatic. It makes you efficient. It lets you course correct when the signal is still subtle, instead of waiting until the system forces your hand. Number 2, why people don't do what they already know. People like to say, I didn't know it would turn out like this. But if we're being honest, most of the time they did know. They sensed it early. They felt the warning. They noticed the pattern starting to form. So why didn't they act? Because seeing the consequences clearly would have forced a decision they weren't ready to make yet. Avoidance isn't confusion, it's delay. Staying vague buys time. Decision demands action. And until someone is willing to tolerate the discomfort of honesty, they will keep acting surprised by outcomes they could see coming. This is where a lot of unnecessary shame creeps in. People assume that if they ignore a consequence, it means they were careless, reckless, or irresponsible. But that is not usually true. What's usually happening is that the consequence is competing with something emotionally charged in the present moment. You know a situation isn't good for you, but leaving it would mean loneliness. You know a habit is costing you, but stopping it would mean sitting with discomfort. You know a conversation needs to happen, but having it would mean conflict or disappointment. So the brain does what it's designed to do. It protects you from immediate pain. It downplays the future cost because the future doesn't feel as real as what's happening right now. That's not a character flaw. That's wiring. Once you understand this, something important shifts. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what am I trying to avoid feeling? That question brings honesty back online. Most people don't avoid consequences because they're ignorant. They avoid them because they are prioritizing short-term emotional relief over long-term stability, often without realizing that is the trade that they are making. Number 3, knowing the math is not the same as using it. This is where most personal growth stalls. People learn the math. They understand cause and effect, but they don't apply it consistently because knowing the right choice doesn't make it comfortable to choose it. Choosing well often means disappointing someone, sitting in discomfort, letting go of familiarity, tolerating uncertainty, and giving up short-term relief for long-term peace. Maturity isn't knowing better. Maturity is being able to tolerate the discomfort of doing better. And that's the gap most people never cross. This is where self-respect quietly enters the conversation. Because choosing well isn't just about logic. It's about whether you trust yourself to tolerate the discomfort without abandoning yourself. If every hard choice feels like a threat to your identity, you'll keep negotiating with reality. You'll keep postponing decisions you know you need to make. You'll keep telling yourself, I'll deal with it later, even when later keeps getting more expensive. But when self-respect is in place, something changes. You stop seeing discomfort as danger. You see it as temporary, manageable, and worth it. You are able to say, this is uncomfortable, but it's honest. Or, this feels hard now, but it will feel better later. And actually believe yourself when you say it. That's why maturity isn't about willpower. It is about internal safety. When you trust yourself not to disappear the moment things get hard, you don't need to escape into impulsive choices. You can stay present long enough to choose cleanly. Number 4, most people were never taught to see consequences. Most people don't ignore consequences because they're reckless. They ignore them because they haven't learned how to forecast. They look at choices in isolation instead of sequence. They ask how something feels right now instead of asking where it leads. Consequences don't operate in moments. They operate in patterns. One choice rarely ruins your life, but repeated choices in the same direction always do. Learning to think in sequences instead of moments isn't willpower, it is a skill. One of the simplest shifts you can make is learning to zoom out just one step further than you normally do. Most impulsive decisions live in a very narrow time frame. They're focused on how something feels right now, how uncomfortable it would be to say no in the moment, or how badly you want relief from whatever you are carrying. But consequences don't live in that narrow window. They live in sequence. When you zoom out and ask, what usually happens after this? The picture gets clearer very quickly. You start seeing patterns instead of moments. You start recognizing familiar outcomes before you repeat them. This isn't about predicting the future perfectly. It's about recognizing your patterns. How do you usually feel after you ignore something? After you overcommit? After you stay quiet when something feels off? After you choose the easy option instead of the honest one? You already have the data. Consequence prediction just means you are finally willing to look at it. Number 5, real control starts when you can see consequences coming. Real control doesn't come from discipline or restriction. It comes from foresight. When you learn to predict consequences before you choose, impulsivity drops. Emotional reactivity softens, anxiety decreases, and regret shrinks. You don't need to be strict with yourself. You need to be honest with yourself early. That honesty removes most of the drama people associate with self-control. This is why people who think ahead don't look frantic or reactive. They are not constantly cleaning up messes they could have avoided. They are not spending emotional energy repairing things that didn't need to break. They have learned that most stress is optional if you're willing to feel a little discomfort early. They choose the awkward conversation now instead of resentment later, the clear boundary now instead of burnout later, the honest no instead of the regret later. That's not restriction, that's freedom. And the more often you do this, the more automatic it becomes. You don't have to white knuckle your way into better behavior. Your system starts preferring alignment because it remembers how much easier life feels when you don't betray yourself. Number 6, how to think ahead without getting overwhelmed. Consequence prediction doesn't require perfect answers or deep analysis. It requires better questions. Instead of asking what you feel like doing, you ask what this returns. Instead of asking what you want right now, you ask how you usually feel after choices like this. Instead of asking whether something is allowed, you ask where it leads. You don't need certainty, you just need honesty. And when you start asking those questions consistently, you stop arguing with reality and start choosing with clarity. A lot of people worry that thinking about consequences will make them anxious or rigid, but the opposite is usually true. Anxiety comes from uncertainty and cleanup, from not knowing what's coming, from dealing with preventable fallout. When you get in the habit of asking, what does this lead to, your nervous system relaxes because it knows you're paying attention. It knows you're not going to blindly walk into something you will regret. You don't need to interrogate every decision, just the ones that feel familiar in a bad way, the ones that come with a little internal hesitation, the ones you've figured out before and didn't like the outcome. Thinking ahead doesn't make life heavier, it makes it quieter. Number 7, why this changes everything. When you see consequences as feedback instead of punishment, life stops feeling hostile. When you understand why you avoid looking at costs, shame drops away. When you learn to tolerate short-term discomfort, long-term stability becomes possible. And when you can see the return of your actions before you take them, your life stops feeling chaotic, not because it's perfect, but because it's directed. That's the real power here, not control over life, but alignment with reality. The goal here isn't to avoid consequences entirely. That's impossible. The goal is to stop being surprised by the ones you keep repeating. When you can see the cost coming, you get to decide whether it's worth paying. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But either way, you are choosing, not reacting. And that's what adulthood actually looks like. Not perfection, not control. Just honest cause and effect thinking applied early enough to matter. You don't need more motivation. You don't need to be harder on yourself. You don't need to try more. You need to see clearly early. Consequences aren't punishment. They are feedback. And when you learn to read that feedback before you choose, you stop paying for lessons you could have avoided. That's how life becomes calmer, steadier, and more predictable. Not by luck, but by intent. I've linked a companion PDF in the description below to help you identify patterns as feedback, so you can be prepared for when they come up in everyday life. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and I will see you in the next one.